5 Disturbing Things Found in Abandoned American Hospitals, Part 1. Hey everyone, welcome back. Or if you're new here, welcome. It's late, I know. You've probably got work tomorrow, or class, or just responsibilities. But here we are anyway, about to spend the next hour and a half talking about things that were left behind in places nobody wanted to stay. Tonight, we're drifting into the world of abandoned American hospitals. Not the sanitized, brightly lit places you go to get your appendix out. No, these are the ones that closed down decades ago. The ones where the lights don't work anymore, where the floors are covered in debris, and where people keep finding things. Things that probably should have been disposed of properly. Things that raise questions nobody really wants to answer. So go ahead and dim the lights, get comfortable. Maybe put your phone on silent. Because we're about to explore 5 particularly unsettling discoveries made in hospitals that America just walked away from. And look, I'm not going to pretend this is going to be thrilling. We're not building to some huge reveal. We're just going to meander through these stories nice and slow and let them wash over you. Because sometimes the creepiest things aren't the dramatic ones. Sometimes they're just the quiet reminders that institutions fail, people are forgotten, and bureaucracy is really bad at cleaning up after itself. Let's start with the first discovery. Discovery 1. The baby dolls of Forest Haven. Forest Haven Asylum in Laurel, Maryland, closed its doors in 1991. It had been operating since 1925 as an institution for people with developmental disabilities, though for most of its existence they used different, crueler terms. By the time it closed, the place had racked up quite the reputation for neglect, abuse, and mysterious deaths. Naturally, when it shut down, the state of Maryland handled the closure with all the grace and thoroughness you'd expect from a bureaucracy that just wanted to move on. Which is to say, they basically just left everything. When urban explorers started venturing into Forest Haven in the early 2000s, they found the place frozen in time. Medical records scattered across floors, wheelchairs rusting in corners, rooms that looked like people had just stood up and walked away mid-task. But one of the most frequently photographed and discussed discoveries was the baby dolls. Not just 1 or 2 dolls, dozens of them, maybe more, scattered throughout the children's wing in various states of decay. Some were tucked into the rusted metal cribs that still lined the walls. Others were piled in corners, their plastic faces cracked and discolored. A few were missing limbs. Many were missing eyes, leaving just dark, hollow sockets that stared at nothing. Now, you might think, okay, these were probably therapy dolls, right? Used to help patients learn caregiving skills or provide comfort. And you'd probably be right, that's the logical explanation. The one that makes sense. But here's the thing that bothered people. The dolls weren't just scattered randomly. In several rooms they were arranged, positioned deliberately, sitting in circles, lined up along windowsills, placed in wheelchairs, facing the walls. Maybe that was the patience. Maybe in those final chaotic days before the closure, when staff members were leaving and routines were breaking down, some of the residents arranged their dolls the way they wanted them, as a comfort, or a ritual, or just because they could. Or maybe it was urban explorers, staging creepy photos for internet clout. That's also very possible. Likely, even. But the photographs from the earliest explorations, before Forest Haven became a popular destination for amateur ghost hunters with cameras, show those arrangements too. And there's something about the image of those eyeless baby dolls, sitting in perfect circles in rooms that hadn't been touched in years, that's just uncomfortable. The really disturbing part, though. The dolls are the least troubling thing found at Forest Haven. Medical records discovered on-site detailed deaths that were never properly investigated, patients who died from unknown causes or complications with disturbing frequency, children who entered the institution and simply disappeared from any further documentation. One photographer found a ledger in an abandoned office that listed patient deaths by year. Some years had dozens of entries. The causes of death were often vague. Respiratory failure, heart complications, malnutrition. In a facility funded by the state of Maryland, in the 1970s and 80s, people were dying of malnutrition. The baby dolls became the symbol of Forest Haven, the image everyone shared online. But they were really just the aesthetic wrapping around something much darker. They were the easy thing to look at. The creepy, but ultimately harmless representation of an institution that had failed the most vulnerable people in its care. The dolls got all the attention on social media. The medical records, well, those were harder to turn into viral content. Forest Haven was finally demolished in stages starting in 2013, after years of the property sitting abandoned and accessible to anyone brave or foolish enough to hop the fence. The dolls, presumably, were cleared away with everything else, ground into landfill trash, which is probably where they should have ended up in 1991, rather than being left behind to decay in their little circles for 2 decades. Let's drift over to the second discovery, Discovery 2, the dental chair at Penhurst State School. Penhurst State School and Hospital in Spring City, Pennsylvania, operated from 1908 to 1987. Similar story to Forest Haven, really. Facility designed for people with developmental disabilities. Severe overcrowding, rampant abuse, finally shut down after exposés revealed the conditions inside were, well, let's just say they weren't great. When Penhurst closed, again, not everything was removed. The place is actually massive, multiple buildings sprawling across over 100 acres, so maybe it's slightly more understandable that things got left behind. Not excusable, but understandable. One of the buildings contained a dental office, and when urban explorers found it, the dental chair was still there. Now that by itself isn't necessarily disturbing. Old dental chairs look creepy. That's just a fact. Something about the worn leather restraints and the mechanical arms and the metal headrest. They look like torture devices, even when they're in pristine condition in a modern dentist's office. But the chair at Penhurst was different. It had been modified. Heavy leather straps were bolted to the armrests, not the standard wrist restraints you sometimes see in medical equipment, thick, industrial straps, the kind designed to hold someone down completely. Additional restraints had been added to the leg rests, and bolted to the headrest was a metal cage, a framework that looked designed to immobilize someone's head entirely. Next to the chair was a tray of dental tools, rusted but recognizable, extractors, probes, a hand drill. A hand drill, not an electric one, the kind you have to crank manually. And on the wall behind the chair someone had hung a sign, handwritten, faded but still legible. It said, Behavior Modification Room. Now, here's what we know about Penhurst from the investigations and lawsuits that led to its closure. Dental care for the residents was essentially punishment-based. If you had a cavity, you didn't get anesthetic. The idea was that the pain would teach you to take better care of your teeth. Never mind that many of the residents had cognitive disabilities that made understanding that connection difficult or impossible. Residents were also forcibly restrained for procedures. Not just held still by staff, but strapped down, because they would understandably panic and try to get away from the people causing them pain. The modifications to that dental chair weren't some mystery. They were documented. They were part of the system. The sign on the wall probably wasn't even meant to be sinister. To the people who worked there, it probably seemed perfectly reasonable. You have a behavior problem, you go to behavior modification, which in this case meant being strapped into a chair and having dental work done without pain relief, because that would teach you, obviously. The dental chair became one of the most photographed locations in Penhurst after urban exploration of the property became popular. People would recreate sitting in it for photos, making scared faces for their Instagram followers. The straps would be buckled over them, and someone would take a picture, and it would get posted with captions about how terrifying the place was, which, I mean, fair. It is terrifying, but not because it's haunted or cursed or any of that supernatural stuff people like to project onto it. It's terrifying because it's real. Because we know exactly what that chair was used for. Because there's documentation. Because people went to work every day, put on their scrubs or their white coats, and strapped human beings into that chair and hurt them on purpose, and they called it medicine. The dental chair is still there, by the way. Penhurst is now a historical site, and also operates as a haunted attraction during Halloween season, which is a choice, I guess. The dental chair is roped off now so tourists can look but not touch. There's even a little placard explaining what the room was used for, $30 for admission, extra for the flashlight tour. Let's move on to Discovery 3. Discovery 3. The suitcases at Willard Asylum. Willard Asylum for the Chronic Insane opened in 1869 on the shores of Seneca Lake in upstate New York. It operated for over a century before closing in 1995. Throughout its operation, patients committed to Willard often arrived with a single suitcase containing their belongings. When they died, those suitcases were stored in the attic, not returned to families, not donated, just stored. In 1995, during the closure and cleanup of the facility, workers found approximately 400 suitcases in the attic. They'd been sitting there in many cases for over 50 years. The patients who owned them had died at Willard, most buried in the on-site cemetery in graves, marked only with numbers, and their suitcases had just been stacked away and forgotten. The suitcases became a photography project. The contents were carefully catalogued and photographed by a psychiatrist and photographer named John Crispin. The images are available online. They're beautiful, in a heartbreaking sort of way. Each suitcase tells a tiny story about a person who probably expected to return home eventually. One suitcase belonged to a woman named Madeline. She was committed in 1910. Her suitcase contained carefully folded dresses from that era, a hat with a flower on it, a small Bible, and letters tied with ribbon. Madeline died at Willard in 1969. She was there for 59 years. Her family never claimed her belongings. Another belonged to a man named Lawrence, committed in 1933. His suitcase held a single suit, meticulously maintained, a pair of dress shoes, a pocket watch that had stopped working, a photograph of a woman and 2 children. On the back, in faded ink, "My darlings." Lawrence died in 1952. The photograph stayed in his suitcase for another 43 years after that. There's something particularly disturbing about the condition of many of the belongings. They weren't thrown haphazardly into the suitcases. They were packed carefully. Clothes were folded. Items were wrapped. These people packed like they were going on a trip, like they believed they'd be opening these suitcases again soon, in their own homes, putting everything back where it belonged. Institutionalization in that era was often permanent, even if the initial commitment was supposed to be temporary. Families couldn't afford to keep visiting, couldn't afford to bring their relatives home, especially if they needed ongoing care, so people just stayed, year after year, until the suitcase in the attic was all that remained of their former life. The contents of the suitcases also reveal how little it took to get you locked up in the early 20th century. One woman was committed for reading too many novels, another man for chronic masturbation, a teenage girl for being boy crazy. These weren't violent people or individuals who couldn't care for themselves. They were people whose families or communities decided they were inconvenient, and their suitcases sat in an attic for decades, gathering dust. While the owners died, were buried in numbered graves, and were forgotten by everyone except maybe a few distant relatives who eventually stopped asking questions. The suitcases are now part of a permanent exhibition at the New York State Museum. You can go see them if you want, read the little plaques about who owned them, look at the photographs of the contents, carefully curated and lit for artistic impact. But you can't escape the fact that these were real people's belongings. These were the last possessions of individuals who died in an institution, far from home, believing perhaps until the very end that someday they'd get to unpack that suitcase again. They never did. On to the 4th discovery. This one's a bit different. Discovery 4. The operating theater at Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum. Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum in western West Virginia is one of those places that's become almost too famous. It's been featured on multiple paranormal investigation shows, offers ghost tours, and has essentially turned its dark history into a profitable tourist attraction. The building itself is massive, one of the largest hand-cut stone masonry buildings in North America, constructed between 1858 and 1881. Like the other institutions we've talked about tonight, Trans-Allegheny had a grim operational history before closing in 1994. Overcrowding, abuse, experimental treatments, the usual horrors. But when explorers and later historical preservationists entered the medical wing, they found the operating theater largely intact. And unlike the other discoveries we've discussed, this wasn't about objects left behind. It was about what was discovered in the hospital's records, in conjunction with the physical space. The operating room contained a standard surgical table, cabinets of rusted instruments, and a large overhead light. Nothing seemed particularly unusual at first glance, beyond the decay you'd expect in an abandoned building. But mounted on one wall was a whiteboard, and on it, barely legible, was a list of procedures with dates from 1952 to 1963. The procedures listed were lobotomies. Dozens of them. Here's what you might not know about lobotomies. When we think of them, we tend to imagine the infamous ice pick method, where a sharp instrument was inserted through the eye socket and into the brain. That technique was real. It was called transorbital lobotomy, and it was horrifyingly common for a while. But there was another method that was even more invasive. The prefrontal lobotomy involved drilling holes into the skull, sometimes removing a piece of the skull entirely, then inserting an instrument into the frontal lobe and essentially scrambling it, severing connections, destroying tissue. Trans-Allegheny performed both types. The whiteboard listed which type of procedure each patient received, and next to many of the names were notations. No change. Minimal improvement. Patient deceased. When researchers cross-referenced the names on that whiteboard with hospital records that had been boxed up and stored in the basement, they found something deeply disturbing. Many of the lobotomy patients weren't there for violent or uncontrollable behavior. They were there for depression, for anxiety, for what we'd now recognize as PTSD. One woman, listed on the board as M. Harrison, had been committed by her husband for what the intake form described as nervous exhaustion and excessive tearfulness. She was 32 years old. She received a prefrontal lobotomy in 1954. The post-operative notes described her as calm and compliant. She died 6 years later at the asylum from pneumonia, never having been discharged or visited by her family after the procedure. The records indicated that over 200 lobotomies were performed at Trans-Allegheny between 1949 and 1963, when the procedure finally fell out of favor as evidence of its ineffectiveness and cruelty mounted. But during those 14 years, multiple surgeries happened every month, sometimes every week. The doctor who performed most of them was named Dr. Walter Freeman, not the famous Walter Freeman who pioneered the ice pick lobotomy, a different one which almost makes it worse somehow. Just another doctor, doing what the medical establishment at the time considered legitimate treatment. What makes the operating theatre at Trans-Allegheny particularly disturbing isn't the space itself. It's the documentation. It's knowing exactly how many people were strapped to that table, knowing their names, knowing why they were committed, knowing that the procedure that destroyed their ability to be fully themselves was considered therapeutic. The whiteboard wasn't supposed to survive. It should have been erased at the end of each week, the information transferred to proper records. But someone didn't erase it. Maybe they were rushing at the end of their shift. Maybe they forgot. Maybe they quit and nobody bothered to check. So it stayed for 30 years. A list of names and procedures preserved by accident in an abandoned building. Trans-Allegheny now offers tours that include the medical wing. They've cleaned it up somewhat, made it safe for visitors. The surgical table is still there. The instruments are displayed behind plexiglass now. The whiteboard has been photographed extensively, but was eventually removed and preserved off-site for conservation purposes. You can still visit the operating theatre, though. $35 for the full building tour, $75 for the overnight ghost hunt experience. Let's drift to our final discovery. Discovery 5. The hydrotherapy equipment at Greystone Park Psychiatric Hospital. Greystone Park Psychiatric Hospital in New Jersey operated from 1876 until 2008. It was one of the largest mental health facilities in the United States at its peak, capable of housing over 7,000 patients. By the time it closed, that number had dwindled to fewer than 500, as psychiatric care shifted toward outpatient treatment and smaller community facilities. When the building was slated for demolition, a team of historical preservationists was allowed to document the interior before it was destroyed. In the basement of one of the main buildings, they found the hydrotherapy wing. Now, hydrotherapy in psychiatric care wasn't inherently cruel. The basic idea was that long warm baths could be calming for agitated patients. And that's true, controlled temperature water immersion can have therapeutic effects. But like many psychiatric treatments, the application at places like Greystone went beyond therapeutic. The basement contained rows of bathtubs, not normal bathtubs. These were essentially human-sized boxes, made of thick porcelain, each with a heavy canvas cover that could be stretched over the top and secured with buckles. There was a hole in the center of each cover for the patient's head to stick through. The setup was designed so that a patient could be placed in the tub, the water temperature controlled to specific degrees, and then the cover secured so only their head remained outside. They would be left like that for hours, sometimes days. The water would be kept just warm enough to be tolerable, but not comfortable. The idea was that the prolonged exposure would eventually calm even the most agitated patient through sheer exhaustion, which it did. Because that's what happens when you immobilize someone in tepid water for 12 hours. They become too tired to resist. But the team of preservationists found something else in that basement. Detailed logs, preserved in waterproof boxes, documenting the use of the hydrotherapy equipment from 1920 through 1975. The logs were clinical: time in, time out, patient ID number, initial state, final state, water temperature, any incidents. The incidents column was the disturbing part. Patient became unconscious after 9 hours. Treatment terminated. Patient developed severe skin irritation. Treatment continued. Patient vomited repeatedly. Treatment continued. Patient expired during treatment. Cause listed as respiratory failure. That last one appeared 7 times in the logs. 7 patients died while strapped into hydrotherapy baths at Greystone. The causes of death listed were varied: heart failure, respiratory complications, unknown causes. But the common factor was that they died while immobilized in lukewarm water for extended periods, and the treatments continued after those deaths. There's no indication in the logs that the protocol was changed or reviewed. The deaths were simply noted, and the next patient was scheduled. What made this discovery particularly unsettling for the preservation team was the realization that this was not ancient history. The logs showed hydrotherapy was still being used regularly into the mid-1970s. People alive today might have relatives who were subjected to this, might have visited Greystone and seen those basement rooms. One of the preservationists later described finding a pair of glasses between 2 of the tubs. Small wire-framed glasses, bent and broken. They weren't mentioned in any of the logs, just a forgotten object, dropped by someone who probably needed them and never got them back. The preservation team documented everything, took photographs, measured the equipment, recorded their findings. And then Greystone Park Psychiatric Hospital was demolished in 2015. The basement, the tubs, the logs, all of it ground into rubble and hauled away. There's a park there now, green grass and walking paths. A small historical marker mentions that Greystone Park Psychiatric Hospital once stood on the site and served the community for over a century. It doesn't mention the hydrotherapy wing. It doesn't mention the 7 deaths. It doesn't mention any of the darker details of what happened there, just that it served the community. So those are 5 disturbing things found in abandoned American hospitals. Baby dolls arranged in circles, a modified dental chair with a behavior modification sign, suitcases packed by people who never got to unpack them, a whiteboard listing lobotomies, hydrotherapy tubs with logs documenting deaths. None of these discoveries involved ghosts or supernatural phenomena. They were all just evidence of institutional failure, of bureaucratic neglect, of medical practices that seemed reasonable at the time to the people implementing them, but look horrifying in retrospect. The disturbing part isn't that these places are abandoned, it's that they operated for so long before anyone decided to shut them down. It's that the problems were documented, reported, investigated, and yet the institutions continued, sometimes for decades after the first exposés. It's that we like to think of these as historical horrors, things from a less enlightened time, when really some of these places were operating into the 1990s. People who are middle-aged today might have had family members in these facilities. And maybe that's the thing that keeps people exploring these abandoned buildings, taking photographs, posting them online. Maybe it's not just morbid curiosity. Maybe it's the attempt to document what was deliberately left behind, to make sure it can't be forgotten as easily as those suitcases in the attic or those logs in the basement, or maybe people just like creepy photos for the internet. That's also very possible. Either way, these 5 discoveries happened. The buildings might be gone now, demolished or converted or cleaned up for paranormal tourism. But the evidence existed. The objects were real. The records were genuine. And somewhere, in landfills and storage facilities and museum archives, pieces of these places still remain. Let's continue with more stories. Part 2. Deep Woods Horror. The Dyatlov Pass Incident and America's Forgotten Wilderness Tragedies. All right, we're still here. Still drifting through the darker corners of history. If you're still awake, good for you, I guess. If you're starting to fade, even better. That's kind of the point. We're shifting gears now, moving away from institutional horrors and into something more elemental. We're going into the woods. Or more specifically, we're going to talk about what happens when people go into the woods and something goes terribly, inexplicably wrong. You've probably heard of the Dyatlov Pass incident. 9 Russian hikers in the Ural Mountains in 1959 found dead under mysterious circumstances. Tent cut open from the inside. Bodies scattered across the mountainside, some barely clothed despite sub-zero temperatures. No clear cause of death for some of them. Radiation detected on clothing. The Soviet investigation concluded it was caused by an unknown compelling force. It's been the subject of countless documentaries, books, and theories. Everything from avalanches to military tests to yetis to aliens. And the truth is, we'll probably never know exactly what happened because the investigation was Soviet-era and deliberately obscured, and it was 1959 and the site wasn't properly preserved. But here's the thing. The Dyatlov Pass incident is famous because it's foreign and mysterious and has all the trappings of a conspiracy. But America has its own deep woods horror stories. Disappearances and deaths in wilderness areas that are just as baffling, just as disturbing, and far less discussed. So let's talk about those instead. We'll start with the case of Geraldine Largay, the Appalachian Trail horror. Geraldine Largay. Geraldine Largay was 66 years old in 2013 when she decided to hike the Appalachian Trail. Not the whole thing. She was starting in Maine and hiking southbound, planning to complete the northern section. She wasn't inexperienced. She'd been preparing for this hike for years. She had the right equipment, the right training, and regular check-ins planned with her husband. On July 22, 2013, Geraldine stepped off the trail to use the bathroom. That's it. That's how simple it was. She stepped maybe 30 or 40 feet off the trail into the woods, and when she tried to return, she couldn't find the trail again. She got lost less than 100 feet from the Appalachian Trail. Now, if you've never been in dense woods, this might sound impossible. How could you not find a trail that's right there? But if you've ever been in a proper forest, you understand. Once you're in thick vegetation, everything looks the same. Every direction looks like it could be the way back. And if you panic, if you start moving quickly without keeping track of your direction, you can become completely disoriented in minutes. Geraldine tried to find her way back. She sent text messages to her husband, but they didn't go through. No cell service in that part of Maine. She wrote desperate messages in her cell phone, documenting her situation, hoping they would send when she got signal. They never sent. Geraldine Largay died in those woods, less than 2 miles from the Appalachian Trail. She died of exposure and starvation, and here's the really horrible part. It took almost 3 weeks. Her remains weren't found until October 2015, more than 2 years after she went missing. A forester discovered her campsite by accident, found her body in her sleeping bag, found her journal documenting her slow decline. She'd built a shelter. She'd collected firewood. She'd rationed her food. She'd done everything right to survive. But she was off the trail, and despite massive search efforts, including helicopters, search dogs, and hundreds of volunteers, nobody found her. How does that happen? How does someone die less than 2 miles from a heavily trafficked hiking trail while search teams are actively looking for them? The answer is simple and terrifying. The woods are really, really good at swallowing people. The main warden service estimated that searchers passed within 100 feet of Geraldine's location multiple times during the active search, but they didn't see her or her shelter because the forest was too dense, because she was in a slight depression in the terrain, because she was exhausted and possibly not making noise when searchers were nearby. Her journal documented her decline. The first entries were practical, describing her situation, noting her attempts to signal for help. She tried to light signal fires, but the wood was too wet. She tried to walk out, but kept ending up back at her shelter. Then the entries became more desperate. Expressions of love for her family, apologies, acceptance. The final entry was dated August 6th, 2 weeks after she got lost. It said, "When you find my body, please call my husband and daughter." They found that entry 2 years later. The Geraldine Largay case is horrifying, not because of any monster or villain, but because of how easily it happened and how impossible she was to find, despite massive efforts. She died well within the search radius. She died in a place that searchers traversed, but the forest kept her hidden until she'd been dead for over 2 years, and she's far from the only one. The missing 411 phenomena. There's a former police detective named David Paulides who's written extensively about disappearances in national parks and forests. His work is controversial. He tends toward the sensational, implies supernatural explanations, and cherry-picks data to make patterns appear more mysterious than they might be. But even if you discard his wilder theories, the core data is disturbing. Thousands of people have vanished in America's wilderness areas under circumstances that don't quite make sense. Not all of them, of course. Many missing persons cases in wilderness areas have mundane explanations. People fall, get injured, succumb to exposure. Animals scavenge remains. The elements destroy evidence. That accounts for most disappearances. But then there are the cases that don't fit those patterns. Children found miles from where they disappeared, in terrain they couldn't have traversed alone. Bodies discovered in areas that were thoroughly searched multiple times. People who vanish in good weather with plenty of supplies and experience. Let's look at a few specific cases, because the details are where things get unsettling. The case of Dennis Martin. Dennis Martin was 6 years old in June 1969 when his family went camping in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. The family was having a picnic near Spence Field, a popular camping area. Dennis and his brother, along with 2 other boys, decided to play a prank on their parents. The plan was simple. The boys would hide in the bushes nearby and jump out to scare the adults. Dennis went into the bushes. The other 3 boys went to a different location. When they jumped out to surprise the parents, Dennis wasn't with them. They called for him. No response. They searched the immediate area. Nothing. Within hours, park rangers had initiated a massive search. Within days, it became one of the largest search efforts in the history of the National Park Service. Over 1,400 searchers, including military personnel, participated. Helicopters scoured the forest. Search dogs covered hundreds of miles. They never found Dennis Martin. Not a single trace. No clothing. No remains. Nothing. The area where he disappeared was thoroughly searched within hours of his disappearance. The weather was good. He'd been wearing a bright red t-shirt. And yet somehow a 6-year-old boy vanished completely in a matter of seconds from a location less than 100 feet from his family. Several searchers reported something odd during the search. They heard what sounded like a child's scream, distant and echoing, coming from deep in the forest. But when they went toward the sound, they found nothing. The scream was never heard again. One witness, a man named Harold Key, reported seeing something unusual on the day Dennis disappeared. He was up on a ridge overlooking the area and claimed he saw what looked like a rough-looking man, carrying something over his shoulder, moving quickly through the forest below. By the time Key processed what he'd seen and alerted authorities, whatever he'd witnessed had disappeared into the wilderness. The disappearance of Stacey Ann Arras. Stacey Ann Arras was 14 years old in July 1981 when she went on a horseback riding trip in Yosemite National Park with her father and a group of other riders. They were on a guided trip, following established trails accompanied by experienced guides. On the second day of the trip, the group stopped for a lunch break near Sunrise High Sierra Camp. Stacey told her father she was going to take some photographs of a nearby lake. The lake was visible from the lunch spot, maybe 150 yards away. Her father watched her walk toward the lake. She had her camera and her small day pack. She reached the lake, spent a few minutes there taking photos, and then started walking back. Her father looked away briefly to help with the horses. When he looked back, Stacy was gone. The guides immediately initiated a search. The area between the lake and the lunch spot was open terrain, high alpine meadow with scattered trees. There was nowhere to hide, no dense forest, no cliffs or ravines. You could see across the entire area. But Stacy Ann Arras had vanished. The subsequent search was massive. Park rangers, search and rescue teams, helicopters, search dogs. Everyone looked for Stacy. The search continued for weeks, then months. Nothing was ever found. Not her camera, not her day pack, not a single item of clothing. Nothing. Eventually, a pair of her lens caps from her camera were found about 50 feet from where she was last seen. That's it. 2 lens caps. No other trace of Stacy Ann Arras has ever been discovered. The terrain where she disappeared doesn't allow for easy explanations. She wasn't near water deep enough to drown in. There were no cliffs she could have fallen from, no dense forest to get lost in. The area was actively being observed by multiple people, and she disappeared in broad daylight in open terrain. The official theory is that she was abducted, possibly by a stranger who happened to be in the area and took advantage of a brief moment when she was alone. But nobody saw a stranger. Nobody saw anything unusual. And in that kind of terrain, you'd expect someone carrying a struggling teenager to be visible for quite a distance. Unless she went willingly with someone. Unless she was grabbed and immediately rendered unconscious. Unless something we can't adequately explain happened. Stacy Ann Arras was 14 years old. She was last seen walking toward her father in open terrain, and then she was just gone. Her case remains unsolved. Her parents have both since passed away, never knowing what happened to their daughter. One more case. Then we'll move on to something slightly different. The strange death of Aaron Hedges. Aaron Hedges was an experienced outdoorsman, a former Army Ranger, and familiar with wilderness survival. In September 2014, he went hiking with 2 friends in the crazy mountains of Montana. They were experienced hikers, properly equipped and hiking in good weather. On September 7th, Aaron separated from his friends briefly to scout ahead on the trail. This wasn't unusual. He'd done it before on their hikes. He radioed back to his friends that he'd found a good path and would meet them at a specified location. He never arrived. His friends searched for him, then alerted authorities. A massive search operation was launched. Search and rescue teams combed the area for days. They found Aaron Hedges 2 weeks later, on September 22nd. His body was in an area that had already been searched. He was partially buried in a shallow depression, covered with debris. Here's where it gets strange. Aaron's body was in an area he shouldn't have been able to reach in the time he was missing. The terrain between where he was last seen and where he was found was rugged enough that it should have taken much longer to traverse than the time he'd been gone before being found. His equipment was scattered. His backpack was found in one location, his jacket in another. Items from his pack were spread over a wide area. And his body showed no signs of animal predation, despite being in the wilderness for 2 weeks. No significant decomposition considering the time elapsed. Search and rescue personnel described his body as looking arranged, as if it had been deliberately placed there. The official cause of death was listed as exposure, but that didn't explain the location, the scattered equipment, or the lack of decomposition. Aaron Hedges was trained in survival. He knew how to signal for help, build shelter, find water, and yet somehow he ended up in a location he shouldn't have been, with his equipment scattered, and his body showing few signs of having been in the wilderness for 2 weeks. His friends reported something odd during their search before official teams arrived. They found what looked like a trail of Aaron's equipment, items dropped at intervals, as if marking a path. But the path led to nowhere. It ended abruptly in an area with no significant features. One of the searchers, speaking unofficially years later, mentioned that Aaron's body position was unusual. He was found face down, partially buried, with his hands positioned as if he'd been trying to dig or grab something. His fingernails were damaged, dirt underneath them, suggesting he'd been clawing at the ground. But there was nothing under him, no buried object, No reason for the position. The crazy mountains have a reputation in Montana. Local indigenous tribes traditionally avoided certain areas of the range, considering them spiritually dangerous. Hikers and hunters regularly report feeling watched, hearing unexplained sounds, or experiencing sudden, overwhelming fear that causes them to leave the area immediately. Rationally, these are just mountains, just wilderness. The feelings people experience are probably just the natural unease that comes from being alone in a vast, indifferent landscape. But Aaron Hedges was found in one of those areas the locals avoid, and the circumstances of his death remain unexplained despite investigation. These cases, and hundreds like them, create a disturbing pattern. Not a supernatural pattern necessarily. Not something that requires believing in monsters, or alien abductions, or interdimensional portals. Just a pattern that suggests our wilderness areas are far more dangerous and disorienting than we give them credit for. That getting lost is easier than we think. That terrain can confuse even experienced hikers. That human remains are surprisingly difficult to find in dense forest. That sometimes people walk into the woods and simply cease to exist in any meaningful, traceable way. The woods don't need to be supernatural to be horrifying. They just need to be indifferent. And they are. The forest doesn't care if you're experienced or prepared or loved by people who will search for you. You walk in, and if something goes wrong, if you make one mistake or encounter one bit of bad luck, the forest will keep you. It will make you part of itself. And searchers might pass within feet of your remains and never know you're there. That's the real deep woods horror, not monsters. Just the cold, patient efficiency of nature reclaiming what wanders into it. Let's continue with some more unsettling wilderness stories. Part 3. The Alaskan Small-Town Horror. Disappearances in America's Last Frontier. We're still here, still drifting, you're doing great. Or you're asleep. Either option is fine. Let's talk about Alaska now. Because if anywhere in America qualifies as genuinely isolated, genuinely wilderness, genuinely dangerous, it's Alaska. Alaska is massive. Most people don't really comprehend how big it is. It's more than twice the size of Texas. If you overlaid Alaska onto the contiguous United States, it would stretch from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean. And most of it is wilderness. Not, oh, this is a nice forest wilderness. Actual untouched, unmapped, lethal wilderness. Alaska has a population of about 730,000 people. For context, that's fewer people than live in Columbus, Ohio, spread across 665,000 square miles, which means there's a lot of empty space, a lot of places where nobody lives, nobody goes, and nobody would hear you scream. And Alaska has a missing persons rate that's twice the national average. People disappear in Alaska with disturbing regularity. Some of those disappearances are understandable. Bush pilots crash in bad weather. Hikers underestimate the terrain. Fishermen fall overboard in freezing water. Alaska is objectively dangerous if you're not careful. But then there are the small-town disappearances. The cases where people vanish from populated areas, from places with neighbors and roads and regular human presence. Those are harder to explain. Let's start with a famous case, the Alaska Triangle. There's a region in Alaska, loosely defined as the area between Anchorage, Juneau, and Utqiagvik, formerly known as Barrow, that's been dubbed the Alaska Triangle. It's Alaska's version of the Bermuda Triangle, and like its more famous counterpart, it's a bit of sensationalized nonsense. But also like the Bermuda Triangle, the underlying data is real. A disproportionate number of disappearances occur in this region. Over 20,000 people have vanished in Alaska since 1988. More than half of those disappearances occurred within the Alaska Triangle. Most have mundane explanations, but not all of them. The most famous Alaska Triangle disappearance is the case of Congressman Hale Boggs and Nick Begich, the disappearance of two congressmen. In October 1972, Congressman Hale Boggs of Louisiana and Congressman Nick Begich of Alaska, along with Begich's aide Russell Brown and pilot Don Johns, boarded a small aircraft in Anchorage. They were flying to Juneau for a campaign fundraiser. The flight should have taken about 3.5 hours. They never arrived. The plane disappeared somewhere over the Gulf of Alaska. Despite one of the most extensive search operations in Alaska's history, over 40 days of searching, covering 325,000 square miles, involving the Coast Guard, Air Force, Navy, and Civil Air Patrol, no trace of the plane was ever found. Not a single piece of wreckage. No bodies, no debris, nothing. 4 people, including 2 sitting members of Congress, vanished completely. Now, planes disappearing in Alaska isn't particularly unusual. The weather is unpredictable, the terrain is unforgiving, and many areas are so remote that wreckage might not be found for decades, if ever. There are probably dozens of crashed planes in the Alaskan wilderness that nobody's discovered yet. But the Boggs Begich disappearance had some odd elements. The weather on the day of the flight was poor but not catastrophic. The pilot, Don Johns, was experienced with 17,000 flight hours. The plane was properly maintained, and the flight plan took them over areas that were regularly traversed by other aircraft. Some witnesses reported seeing a plane matching the description flying erratically shortly before it disappeared from radar, but those sightings were never confirmed. In the years since, there have been occasional claims of wreckage sightings, pieces of metal in remote locations, items washed up on beaches, but none have ever been confirmed as belonging to the missing plane. Congressman Hale Boggs was declared legally dead in 1973. Nick Begich was also declared dead. His seat in Congress was filled by his wife, Peggy Begich, in a special election. The pilot and aide were similarly declared deceased. But nobody knows what happened to them. Nobody knows where they are. 4 people flew into the Alaskan sky and ceased to exist. That case is famous because of who was involved. But Alaska has smaller disappearances, quieter ones that are just as disturbing. Let's talk about the town of Nome. The Nome disappearances. Nome is a small city on the western coast of Alaska, population about 3,500. It's remote. There are no roads connecting Nome to the rest of Alaska. You can only get there by plane or boat. During winter, when the sea freezes, you can drive across the ice, but that's the only land access. Nome has a missing persons problem. Since the 1960s, an unusually high number of people have disappeared from Nome and the surrounding area. The exact number is disputed. Estimates range from 24 to over 40 people, depending on which cases you include and which time frame you consider. Many of the missing are Alaska Native people, and there's strong evidence that some of these disappearances are the result of violence, particularly violence against Indigenous women. That's a real problem, a systemic issue that doesn't get enough attention, and I don't want to minimize that by treating these disappearances as mysterious, when some of them are probably crimes with human perpetrators. But even accounting for that, Nome's disappearance rate is statistically abnormal. One of the most disturbing cases is Leanne Lusink, the disappearance of Leanne Lusink. Leanne Lusink was 19 years old in July 2003 when she vanished from Nome. She'd been visiting friends, spending the evening socializing, nothing unusual. Around 3 a.m. she left to walk home. It was summer in Nome, so it was still light out. Alaska has nearly 24 hours of daylight in summer. She was walking through a populated area of Nome. Not wilderness, not an isolated road right through town. She never made it home. Nobody saw anything. Nobody heard anything. She just didn't arrive. The investigation found nothing. No witnesses, no evidence of a struggle, no indication of where she went. Her body was found 3 years later, in 2006, in an area outside Nome that had been searched multiple times. Just bones. No clothing, no personal effects, nothing to indicate how she died or how she got there. The area where her remains were found was near a road, not far from town. It wasn't deep wilderness, and it had been searched with ground teams and search dogs during the initial investigation, but she wasn't found for 3 years. The official theory is that she was the victim of foul play, that someone abducted and killed her. That's probably correct. But it doesn't explain why she wasn't found during the initial searches, or why her remains were discovered in such an accessible location years later. Leanne Lusink wasn't the only person to disappear from Nome that year. 3 other people vanished from the same area within months of her disappearance. None of them have been found. The Tonsina River disappearances. Let's shift to a different part of Alaska. The Tonsina River Valley, a few hours east of Anchorage. In 2013, 2 experienced hunters, Michael Hebert and Sean McManamy went on a hunting trip in the Tonsina area. They were familiar with the region, properly equipped, and expected to be gone for about a week. They didn't return. Search teams found their campsite. It was undisturbed. Their truck was parked nearby. Their equipment was at the camp. But Michael and Sean were gone. The search continued for weeks. No trace was found. Then, 2 months later, Michael Hebert's body was discovered. He was about 10 miles from the campsite, in terrain that didn't match the route he should have taken. His body showed no signs of animal predation or obvious cause of death. Sean McManamy has never been found. What happened? Why would two experienced hunters abandon their camp and equipment? Why would one of them end up 10 miles away in an unexpected direction? Where is Sean? Nobody knows. The area where this happened isn't particularly remote by Alaskan standards. It's accessible by road. People hunt and camp there regularly. But somehow 2 grown men vanished, and only one has been recovered, found in a location that doesn't make sense. The explanation. Nobody wants to consider. Here's the thing about Alaska that people don't like to think about. It's genuinely dangerous in ways that the lower 48 states just aren't. The wildlife is dangerous. Bears, both black and grizzly. Moose, which kill more people in Alaska than bears do. Wolves. These aren't creatures you can casually encounter and walk away from if things go wrong. The terrain is dangerous. Permafrost makes the ground unstable. Rivers swell unpredictably. Glaciers hide crevasses. The weather changes from clear to life-threatening in hours. The isolation is dangerous. Cell service is non-existent in most areas. Rescue, if it comes, might take days. And if you're not found quickly in Alaska, you probably won't be found at all. But beyond the physical dangers, there's something about Alaska that makes disappearances harder to investigate. The sheer scale of the place means that even populated areas are surrounded by vast wilderness. Someone could walk a few miles in any direction and be completely alone, beyond help, beyond rescue. And Alaska attracts people who want to disappear. People running from something, people who don't want to be found. Some of Alaska's missing persons might not be missing at all. They might be deliberately gone, living off-grid, avoiding their former lives. But that doesn't account for all of them. It doesn't explain cases like Leanne Lusink, who vanished from town in broad daylight. It doesn't explain the congressman who disappeared in a plane that should have been findable. It doesn't explain hunters who abandon their equipment and end up miles from where they should be. Alaska has a way of swallowing people, not mysteriously, not supernaturally, just practically, efficiently, the way a vast wilderness will always reclaim anything that ventures into it unprepared. The horror of Alaska isn't that it's haunted or cursed, it's that it's indifferent. You can disappear there and the land won't notice. You'll just become another statistic, another face on a missing persons poster, another case that eventually goes cold because there's too much space and too few clues. And for the families left behind, that indifference might be the worst part. Let's move on to something slightly different, but equally unsettling. Part 4. The Hotel Horror. The Cecil Hotel and America's Darkest Lodgings. Still with me? Good, or not good, depending on your perspective. We're about halfway through now. This is the part where the script gets a little more focused, a little more specific. We're going to talk about hotels, not the nice kind, not the chain hotels with continental breakfast and sanitized rooms. We're talking about the kind of hotels that accumulate darkness. The ones with histories so grim that they become infamous. The ones where multiple people have died in ways that raise questions. And there's no better place to start than the Cecil Hotel in Los Angeles. The Cecil Hotel. The Cecil Hotel was built in 1924 in downtown Los Angeles. It was meant to be a destination for business travelers and tourists, a respectable establishment in what was then a relatively upscale part of the city. That's not what it became. As downtown LA declined in the mid-20th century, the Cecil Hotel declined with it. By the 1950s, it was primarily housing long-term residents, many of them struggling with poverty, addiction, or mental illness. The neighborhood around it became known for crime and homelessness, and the Cecil Hotel became known for death. The first recorded suicide at the Cecil was in 1931. A guest named W.K. Norton poisoned himself with capsules in his room. That set a precedent. Over the following decades, at least 16 people died by suicide at the Cecil Hotel. They jumped from windows, they overdosed in rooms, they hanged themselves in bathrooms, but suicides weren't the only deaths. In 1964, a woman named Pigeon Goldie Osgood, a retired telephone operator who fed pigeons in nearby Pershing Square, was found dead in her room. She'd been raped, stabbed, and beaten. Her killer was never found. In 1992, a woman was found dead in her room. She'd been stabbed multiple times. No arrests were made. The Cecil Hotel also had the distinction of hosting not one, but two serial killers. Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, stayed at the Cecil during his 1985 killing spree. He paid $14 a night for a room on the top floor. Residents recalled seeing him covered in blood in the elevator late at night. He would walk past them, blood on his clothes and hands, and nobody reported it because, well, it was the Cecil Hotel. People minded their own business. Jack Unterweger, an Austrian serial killer who murdered prostitutes, stayed at the Cecil in 1991 while in Los Angeles ostensibly as a journalist. He killed at least 3 women during his stay. He was later convicted and died by suicide in prison. The hotel became notorious. People started calling it the Suicide Hotel or Hotel Death. But it continued operating because apparently there's always a market for cheap rooms in downtown LA, no matter how many people have died there. And then in 2013 came the case that made the Cecil Hotel internationally infamous. Elisa Lam. Elisa Lam was a 21-year-old Canadian student who checked into the Cecil Hotel in January 2013. She was traveling alone, blogging about her trip, visiting bookstores and museums in LA. On January 31, 2013, she was reported missing. Her parents hadn't heard from her. The hotel confirmed she hadn't checked out. Police investigated. They reviewed security footage from the hotel. What they found was deeply unsettling. The elevator surveillance video, recorded on the last day anyone saw Elisa alive, showed her entering the elevator alone. She pressed multiple buttons. The elevator doors opened and closed repeatedly, but didn't move. Elisa peeked out into the hallway, then stepped back in. She pressed herself into the corner. She gestured as if talking to someone, but nobody was visible in the footage. Then she stepped out of the elevator, partially visible at the edge of the frame. She made strange hand gestures, waving her arms in unusual patterns. She looked like she was hiding, or dancing, or something. The video wasn't conclusive. Then she disappeared from view. The elevator doors closed and finally the elevator worked normally. That was the last confirmed sighting of Elisa Lam alive. The video went viral. People analyzed it frame by frame. Theories proliferated. She was being chased. She was having a mental health crisis. She was on drugs. The video was edited. The elevator was malfunctioning. She was seeing something supernatural. For 19 days, nobody knew what happened to Elisa Lam. Then guests at the Cecil Hotel started complaining about the water. Low pressure, strange taste, dark color. Maintenance workers checked the water tanks on the roof. Elisa Lam's body was floating in one of the rooftop water tanks. She'd been dead for weeks, decomposing in the water supply. Guests had been drinking, bathing in, and brushing their teeth with water that contained her remains. The rooftop access was locked. The water tanks had heavy lids. Elisa had somehow gotten onto the roof, removed the lid of a tank, climbed inside, and then the lid had somehow been replaced. The official cause of death was accidental drowning. Toxicology showed she had traces of her prescribed bipolar medication in her system, but not at therapeutic levels, suggesting she hadn't been taking it regularly. The conclusion was that Elisa had been experiencing a mental health crisis, possibly a manic episode or psychotic break. She'd somehow accessed the roof, gotten into the water tank, and drowned. The strange behavior in the elevator was attributed to her deteriorating mental state. That explanation sort of works, but it leaves questions. How did she access the locked roof? Hotel staff said the door was alarmed and locked. How did she remove the heavy lid of the water tank? The lids required significant force to open. How did the lid get replaced after she climbed in? The tanks were tall. Once inside, she wouldn't have been able to reach the lid. Why wasn't she found sooner? Multiple people were on the roof during the search, including police and search dogs. How did they miss checking the water tanks? The LAPD's answers to these questions were vague. The roof access might not have been properly secured. The lid might not have been heavy. She might have been able to replace it from inside somehow. The search might not have been as thorough as initially reported, but those answers feel incomplete. The Cecil Hotel tried to rebrand after Elisa Lam's death. They changed the name to Stay on Main. They renovated. They tried to distance themselves from the history. It didn't really work. People still knew it was the Cecil Hotel. The building still had the same energy, the same history. In 2021, the hotel converted primarily to affordable housing units. Parts of it remain open as a hotel. You can still stay there if you want. Reviews are mixed. Many guests report feeling uncomfortable, hearing noises, seeing shadows, feeling watched. Are those experiences real? Probably not in any supernatural sense. But the Cecil Hotel has accumulated so much history, so much documented tragedy, that it's impossible to stay there without thinking about it. And once you're thinking about all the deaths, all the suffering, all the darkness that building has witnessed, your brain starts filling in the gaps. You hear the building settling and interpret it as footsteps. You see shadows from passing headlights and interpret them as figures. You feel uneasy because you know you're sleeping in a room where someone might have died violently decades ago. The Cecil Hotel doesn't need to be haunted to be horrifying. Its real history is disturbing enough. Let's look at a couple other American hotels with similar dark histories. The Reed House Hotel, Chattanooga. The Reed House Hotel in Chattanooga, Tennessee, has operated since 1872. It's a beautiful historic building. It's also reportedly one of the most haunted hotels in America. Room 3111 is the focus of most stories. The legend says that a woman was murdered in room 3111 in the 1920s or 30s. She was having an affair, her lover killed her, and her body was found in the room. Since then, guests in room 311 report strange experiences, items moving, lights turning on and off, the sensation of being watched. Some guests report waking up to see a woman standing at the foot of the bed. The hotel acknowledges the stories and even plays into them a bit, noting the history in their promotional materials. But here's the thing. There's no confirmed record of a murder in room 311. The story can't be verified. Local newspapers from the supposed time period don't mention it. Police records don't show it. So, where did the story come from? Probably from guests having unsettling experiences and inventing an explanation. Once a few people reported strange feelings in that room, the story grew. And once the story existed, every subsequent guest who stayed in 311 knew about it, expected something strange, and interpreted normal hotel noises and shadows as supernatural. That's not to say people are lying. They're probably experiencing exactly what they report, but human perception is incredibly influenced by expectation. If you believe a room is haunted, you'll perceive it as haunted. Still, enough people have reported uncomfortable experiences in room 311 that the hotel had to do something about it. They now often keep the room unbooked unless specifically requested. They warn guests about the stories before assigning them to that room. Because whether or not room 311 is actually haunted, guests perceive it as disturbing, and that perception becomes its own kind of truth. The Biltmore Hotel, Los Angeles. The Biltmore Hotel in Los Angeles is another historic building with a dark reputation. It opened in 1923 and has hosted celebrities, politicians, and at least one murder victim. Elizabeth Short, the Black Dahlia, was last seen alive at the Biltmore Hotel in January 1947. She was in the lobby, reportedly meeting someone. Days later, her body was found in a vacant lot, mutilated in ways that shocked even hardened Los Angeles detectives. Her murder has never been solved. The Biltmore doesn't publicize this connection much. It's not great for business to be known as the last place a famous murder victim was seen, but the connection is part of LA history, and people know about it. Guests at the Biltmore sometimes report seeing a woman in 1940s-era clothing in the lobby. She's described as looking sad, lost, or searching for someone. She appears for a moment, then vanishes. Is it Elizabeth Short? Almost certainly not. It's probably just pattern recognition and suggestion, guests seeing what they expect to see because they know the story. But the Biltmore has other reported phenomena: cold spots in certain rooms, elevators that operate by themselves, the sound of footsteps in empty corridors. Again, These could all be explained by old building mechanics, draft patterns, and the power of suggestion. But enough people have reported similar experiences that the hotel has developed a reputation. The Biltmore remains operational and successful. It's a beautiful hotel, but it carries its history with it, and that history includes darkness. Let's take this in a slightly different direction and talk about one more type of hotel horror, the ones that just failed at basic human dignity. The Hotel Carter, New York City. The Hotel Carter in Times Square, New York City, was once rated as the dirtiest hotel in America. Multiple years in a row. Not haunted, not mysterious, just genuinely, objectively filthy. Guests reported bedbugs, roaches, mice, unsanitary bathrooms, bloodstains on walls, and staff that seemed actively hostile to the concept of cleaning. But people stayed there because it was cheap and located in Times Square. Prime location, rock-bottom prices. You just had to ignore the biohazards. The horror of the Hotel Carter wasn't supernatural. It was the horror of institutional negligence, of a business that continued operating despite being objectively unfit for human occupancy, of health inspections that somehow didn't result in closure. So of guests who booked rooms without researching and found themselves in conditions worse than many homeless shelters. The Hotel Carter closed in 2014 and was converted to, I think it's office space now. Doesn't matter. The point is, sometimes hotel horror isn't about ghosts or murders. Sometimes it's just about places that treat human beings with such disregard that staying there becomes its own form of suffering. Hotels are interesting as locations for horror because they're liminal spaces. You're not home. You're not exactly in public. You're in a temporary space surrounded by strangers, sleeping in a bed that thousands of other people have slept in. And if something goes wrong in a hotel, if you feel unsafe, if something disturbing happens, if you see or hear something you can't explain, you can't just leave in the middle of the night. You've paid for the room. Your belongings are there. You're probably in an unfamiliar city. So you stay, you try to sleep, and you tell yourself it was nothing. Just an old building settling. Just your imagination. Just sleep deprivation making you see things. But sometimes, like at the Cecil Hotel, it's not nothing. Sometimes the disturbing history is real. Sometimes people did die in that room. Sometimes the darkness you feel isn't imagined. And sometimes the scariest thing about a hotel isn't what might be haunting it. It's just the accumulation of human suffering that happened there, layer upon layer, year after year, until the walls themselves seem to retain the memory of all that sadness and violence. We're going to shift gears one more time for the final stretch. Part 5. The Final Stories. American Gothic. We're in the home stretch now. If you're still awake, I'm honestly impressed or concerned. Either way, we're almost done. For this last section, I want to talk about a few more stories that don't fit neatly into categories. Just American horror stories, real ones. The kind that happened and were documented, and yet remain deeply unsettling despite having no supernatural elements. Let's start with a case from Texas. The Texas killing fields. Between Houston and Galveston, Texas, there's an area known as the Texas Killing Fields. It's a 25-acre stretch of land along Interstate 45, where since the 1970s, over 30 bodies have been found. Most of them young women, most murdered. The cases are largely unsolved. The first known victim was discovered in 1971, a woman in her 20s, never identified, just found in the field and eventually buried without anyone ever learning who she was. More bodies followed. Women and girls ranging in age from 12 to 25. Some were identified, many weren't. They'd been strangled, shot or beaten, then dumped in that field. Why that specific location? Nobody knows. It's not particularly remote. It's visible from the highway. But for decades, multiple killers apparently chose that same stretch of land to dispose of bodies. Multiple killers, yes. The investigation eventually determined that the murders were committed by different people over the years. Not a single serial killer, but multiple individuals who all independently decided to use the same dumping ground, which somehow makes it worse. Some of the victims were likely killed by convicted murderer Edward Harold Bell, who confessed to killing multiple young women in the area. But he couldn't have committed all the murders. The timeline doesn't work. Robert Abel, a former NASA engineer who owned property near the fields, was investigated extensively but never charged. He died in 2005. Clyde Hedrick was convicted of one murder connected to the area, but most of the Texas Killing Fields murders remain unsolved. Bodies are still occasionally found in that area. As recently as 2016, new remains were discovered. There's something deeply disturbing about a place that becomes known as a dumping ground for murder victims. Not because of geography or isolation, but almost as if the location itself attracts that kind of darkness. Rationally, it's probably just that once a few bodies were found there, other killers heard about it and thought it would be a good place to dispose of their own victims. The field's reputation as a body dump site made it an attractive location for people with bodies to dump. But standing there looking at that field, knowing what's been found there over the years, it feels wrong. It feels cursed, even if you don't believe in curses. Let's move north. The Villisca Axe Murder House. Villisca, Iowa, is a small town of about 200 people. In 1912, it was the site of one of the most brutal unsolved murders in American history. On the night of June 9, 1912, 8 people were murdered in a house in Villisca. 6 members of the Moore family, parents Josiah and Sarah, and their 4 children, plus 2 girls who were staying over. All 8 were killed with an axe while they slept. The crime scene was horrific. Every victim had been struck multiple times. The killer had covered mirrors and windows with clothing, as if trying to block out light or his own reflection. He'd covered the faces of some victims with cloth. He'd left bacon downstairs, partially prepared, suggesting he'd made himself food after the murders. The investigation was botched from the start. Police allowed townspeople to trample through the crime scene. Evidence was contaminated. Multiple suspects were investigated, but nobody was ever conclusively proven guilty. 2 suspects stood out: Reverend George Kelly, a traveling preacher who'd been in Villisca the day of the murders, and Frank Jones, a local businessman who had a grudge against Josiah Moore. Kelly was tried twice but never convicted. Jones was never charged. The case went cold. The house still stands. It's been preserved as a historical site and also operates as a tourist attraction. You can tour it during the day. You can even pay to spend the night there if you're so inclined. Many overnight guests report disturbing experiences, feelings of being watched, unexplained sounds, objects moving, the usual catalogue of haunted house phenomena. Skeptics say it's just the power of suggestion, combined with spending the night in a house where you know 8 people were brutally murdered. Your brain creates the experiences you expect, but some reports are harder to dismiss. Multiple overnight guests, staying on different nights with no contact with each other, have reported hearing what sounds like children's footsteps on the stairs. Others have reported finding small handprints on dusty surfaces that weren't there when they arrived. The most unsettling reports come from people who photographed the house. Digital cameras frequently malfunction in certain rooms. Photos sometimes show shadows or figures that weren't visible when the photo was taken. Now, digital cameras malfunctioning could be explained by electrical interference or equipment issues. Shadows in photos could be artifacts of lighting and image compression, but the consistency of reports is notable, not conclusive. Just notable. The Villisca Axe Murder House isn't creepy because it might be haunted. It's creepy because 8 people, including 6 children, were murdered there for no apparent reason. Because the killer was never caught. Because he ate bacon in the kitchen after killing them. Because that level of violence and cruelty happened in a small Iowa town and was never explained. The potential supernatural elements are just window dressing on a crime that was horrifying enough without them. The LaLaurie Mansion, New Orleans, will end with this one. A story from New Orleans, the LaLaurie Mansion. Madame Delphine LaLaurie was a wealthy socialite in 1830s New Orleans. She and her husband, Dr. Louis LaLaurie, lived in a large mansion in the French Quarter. They were respected members of society. They hosted parties. They were considered charitable and kind. In April 1834, a fire broke out in the LaLaurie mansion. When firefighters responded, they found something in the attic: enslaved people. Multiple individuals, chained in positions that had clearly been maintained for extended periods. Some were malnourished to the point of near death. Some had injuries that appeared to be the result of deliberate torture. Broken bones that had healed incorrectly. wounds that had been repeatedly opened. The discovery became a scandal. A mob formed outside the Lalaurie mansion. Delphine and Louis Lalaurie fled, reportedly escaping to France. The exact details of what was found in the attic have been exaggerated over the years by various retellings. Some accounts describe elaborate torture devices. Some describe medical experiments. Some of those details are probably embellished. But the core truth is documented. Enslaved people were found in the Lalaurie attic in conditions that indicated prolonged abuse and torture.